Hello friends, my name is JJ, and today I wanted to talk about the topic on everybody's mind, which is of course the Canadian general election of 2025. It is coming up very soon, on April 28th, so there is not much time to discuss. So it is hard not to use a lot of superlatives when talking about this year's election. It is certainly one of Canada's most anticipated elections in ages. The stakes of it feel uniquely high, the issues are very serious, and the outcome is guaranteed to be dramatic just because it's so uncertain. So first, some background. The story of Canadian politics over the last few years has been defined by the ever-growing unpopularity of former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and with him, his Liberal Party. This in turn overlapped with the growing popularity of the man who had been nominated by the Conservative Party to run against him way back in 2022, Pierre Poilievre. Public opinion had been drifting so steadily in Pierre's favor that by 2024, there were headlines predicting that he was set to win the largest landslide in Canadian history. However, in some ways, Pierre wound up being too successful for his own good. In January, Prime Minister Trudeau announced that he would preemptively resign from office rather than face a near certain defeat in his bid for a fourth term. This then allowed a new and vastly more popular Liberal Prime Minister to come to power, Mark Carney, and this helped instigate a dramatic unraveling of the whole pre-existing dynamic of Canadian politics. Now, Trudeau's resignation wasn't the only variable that mattered, of course. Trudeau quit around the same time that Donald Trump returned to the presidency of the United States, and for reasons that are deeply baffling to basically everyone, Trump has made it one of the priorities of his first months in office to wage a vicious and unprovoked economic war against Canada in the form of vindictive tariffs on Canadian imports. For equally unclear reasons, the president has also chosen to loudly and often declare that he wants to annex Canada in some fashion and make it into America's 51st state. At the risk of editorializing, I think it is becoming fairly clear that Donald Trump is losing his mind, and a lot of Americans, and especially Republicans, are just choosing to ignore some of the ways in which this is manifesting, including his fixation on Canada.
So if it's made in the United States, there is no tariff. All you have to do is make it in the United States. We don't need it from another country. As an example, Canada, if we make it in the United States, we don't need it to be made in Canada. We'll have the jobs. That's why Canada should be our 51st state. We'll bring back industries, and we'll bring back our jobs, and we'll make America industry great again. So essentially, we're putting on a 25% tariff without exception.
But in Canada itself, where a hatred and fear of the United States has always been a barely concealed part of the national culture, Trump's words and actions seem sincerely frightening and validating. Revulsion and anger towards the United States has accordingly spiked, as have Canadians' demands that our government do more to protect us from this mad and cruel man in the Oval Office. And this has proceeded to further scramble Canadian politics in ways that seem to be working against Pierre Poilievre, which, in the final insult, Trump has expressed sadistic glee about.
I love Canada. I love Wayne
now
Gretzky.
The Liberal guys,
I love his wife.
The Liberal Party is going to win now in the next election, most likely. And they were down and out. Isn't that going to make them more hostile to us and possibly
I'd rather deal with a Liberal than a
for
Conservative.
China, closer to Canada, and that would really put us in a bind.
The Conservative that's running is stupidly no friend of mine. I don't know him, but he said negative things. So when he says negative things, I couldn't care less. I think it's easier to deal, actually, with a Liberal.
As it stands now, the polls are effectively tied, or at least most Canadian reporters and pundits are behaving as if the polls are tied. It definitely feels like it could go either way, with any outcome theoretically possible, just probably not the biggest landslide in Canadian history. I don't think that's going to happen. All right, so let us now talk about the two main candidates of this election in more detail, as well as the issues that they are most eager to fight about and some of the possible outcomes that might result. Mark Joseph Carney has been Prime Minister of Canada for literally just a few days. He was installed by Trudeau's Liberal Party to replace him as Prime Minister on March 14th, in circumstances that have already made him one of the most unusual prime ministers in Canadian history. While it is not uncommon in Canada for an incumbent political party to install a new prime minister when the old one resigns, what is decidedly unusual is for that new prime minister to not be a sitting cabinet minister in the old guy's administration, or indeed even a sitting member of parliament at all. Carney is the former head of the Bank of Canada, who also somewhat strangely worked for a time as head of the Bank of England. Before and after those jobs, he spent a lot of time working as a big shot in the world of high finance for Goldman Sachs and later for the Canadian firm Brookfield Asset Management. So no one can dispute that he was qualified for the job, but at the time he was appointed Prime Minister, he was literally just a private citizen, which kind of feels like it defies the democratic logic of the parliamentary system a bit. But in the Canadian political system, anyone can be installed as Prime Minister as long as they are endorsed by the ruling party, and Carney was, overwhelmingly. Now, in theory, the electoral advantage of installing a new guy to complete an unpopular Prime Minister's term is that the new guy can run the country for a while and win back public support for the ruling party, and Carney could have continued governing until October of 2025, since that is when the next Canadian election legally had to be held. But instead, he chose to make one of his first actions in office the calling of an early election for late April. This is one of the more controversial powers that the Canadian Prime Minister has, the ability to reschedule the election date for any reason he deems fit. And in this case, Carney presumably did it for a few reasons. One, it is always controversial when a party installs a new prime minister who the country never elected. And as I said, Carney's appointment was more democratically dubious than most, so he was presumably eager to move out of this limbo state and get elected to office properly. Two, it was probably just a matter of time before the Parliament voted no confidence in him, which would have triggered an emergency early election anyway, and nothing personal to Carney about that. All of the other parties have been demanding an early election for months, so if anything, Carney was just bowing to popular demand. And three, as I mentioned, the Liberal Party's numbers have been trending up recently, so there is some obvious partisan cynicism at play here. Anyway, this has now resulted in a somewhat comical situation in which Carney is running for election on a record in office that has literally lasted all of 9 days. The other day, his people posted what has got to be one of the strangest political ads that I've ever seen. The humiliation potential of all of this is accordingly quite high. Carney made the rather cocky decision to set the election date as soon as he was legally able to. And this means that if Carney loses, he will become the shortest serving prime minister in Canadian history, with a legacy defined by nothing more than 9 days of governing and a failed election campaign. That would arguably be an even worse legacy than that of Liz Truss, and for a big shot like Carney, a pretty embarrassing thing to have to wear around his neck for the rest of his life. But if he wins, the upside is enormous as well. He'd be the savior of a party that just a few months ago everyone was writing off as a lost cause, and would almost certainly be given huge deference by the Liberals to remake their party and government in his image. All right, now let us talk about Pierre Poilievre, the man who hopes to deal Carney that humiliating blow. As I mentioned, Pierre was voted in as head of the Conservative Party of Canada back in 2022, riding a big wave of COVID-era populist anger at the Trudeau government. This is sort of forgotten today, but his fortunes were dramatically lifted by the notorious anti-Trudeau truckers protest of 2022, who, among their other demands, wanted to see the Conservatives ditch their more moderate leader, Erin O'Toole, in favor of someone who would take the fight to Trudeau with more aggression and passion, and Pierre certainly fit that bill. Pierre has been a Conservative member of Parliament since he was 25, and it doesn't seem like his political views have changed much since then. He has always been a pretty orthodox Conservative with pretty consistent across-the-board Conservative views on most issues. Less government, less taxes, less woke, all of that. That commitment to principle, coupled with his very pugnacious and even slightly nerdy personality, where he likes to argue and debate, has led some people to say he has a certain Ben Shapiro energy to him.
So I'll ask the question again. He wants to hike the tax to 61 cents a liter. If it gets to that high and people are all starving in the streets, will that stop the forest fires?
In the sense of being very intellectually formidable and having a sort of fierce charisma, but also being most compelling to people who already agree with him. Pierre has always had pretty high rates of public disapproval, so the fact that his candidacy for prime minister got as popular as it did was a real testament to either his skills at marketing himself or the sheer depths of the public's loathing of Justin Trudeau. Many Conservatives in Canada were increasingly excited that Pierre's rise to power was going to be a once-in-a-generation opportunity to dramatically remake the Canadian government, but with the polls having tightened so much recently, he is now fighting for his political life. In other words, it is possible that this election will end with him being the victim of one of the greatest humiliations in Canadian history, a man who had success slip through his fingers after holding it so tight for so long. It is more than a little ironic that Donald Trump could be one of the big reasons why. Now, I think the comparisons between the two men can be a bit unfair, since no one is like Donald Trump except Trump himself, but obviously it's possible to see Trump and Pierre as products of a similar sort of conservative populist energy that is surging through many countries at the moment. A good working relationship between the Canadian Prime Minister and the American President is always important, and for a time it was plausible to suspect that Pierre would get along better with Trump than Trudeau, just because they were both conservatives. But then Trump got obsessed with imposing crushing tariffs on Canadian goods and began demagoguing against Canadian independence, and this was bad news for Pierre on several fronts. For one, it made a trade war with the United States the defining issue of Canadian politics, which then pushed all of the beloved conservative priorities that Pierre had previously been campaigning on off to the side, and instead the two parties are now being forced to campaign on rather similar trade war platforms, which reflects the fact that there's just really not that much that Canada can do to deal with an economically belligerent United States. A Canadian Prime Minister can promise to strengthen trade relationships with other countries. He can promise to increase domestic trade within Canada. And he can promise to cut red tape and regulations in order to spur more economic development, particularly in some of Canada's notoriously over-regulated industries like natural resource extraction. And these things are what both Pierre and Carney have promised to do, along with ratcheting up their rhetoric against the United States in general, and Trump in particular, which obviously plays well with Canadian audiences at this particular moment. Both men have promised to stand tough against Trump and accuse the other guy of being weak.
Who's the worst person to stand up to Donald Trump? It's Pierre Poilievre. He worships the man.
It's clear that President Trump wants the Liberals in power because they will keep this country weak.
The other challenge for Pierre just gets at a kind of more complex intersection of ideology and identity in the Canadian psyche. As I've discussed before, Canadian nationalism tends to be a more left-wing phenomenon, in which the most ostentatious patriots tend to be progressive anti-Americans who say that what makes Canada good is a rejection of American conservatism. Conservatives in Canada tend to be more pro-American as a result, which puts them at a political disadvantage when the country is in an anti-American mood. Pierre has been campaigning with increasingly anti-American rhetoric.
In the words of our great first Prime Minister, Conservatives will fight, and I quote, to give us a great, a united, a rich, an improving, a developing Canada, instead of making us a tributary to American laws, American railways, American bondage, and American tolls.
But it doesn't seem to come natural to him, and it's even controversial with his own base, who value US-Canada relations very highly, and good relations with Trump in particular. This is why Trump's recent habit of angrily condemning Pierre for daring to be offended at things that Trump has done so utterly deranged. It suggests that Trump is too vain to understand Canada-US relations in any sort of strategic way, and is instead eager to push both of Canada's parties in an increasingly anti-American direction for no obvious reason beyond damaging US-Canada relations for its own sake. Carney, for his part, has been keen to portray Pierre and Trump as being cut from the same right-wing cloth, which plays into the Canadian unpopularity of Trump not just on the basis of his tariffs, but also the style of government that we've seen him impose on America, with Doge and things of that sort. In his kickoff campaign speech, Carney used a line where he suggested that voting for Pierre will bring only division and Americanism to Canada.
One of the decisions that Canadians will have to make, whether they want a government that is unified, that's standing up for Canada, and is taking focused action to build a better economy, or they want division and Americanism. And that's what Mr. Poilievre seems to be offering.
Which is a pretty succinct summary of what the Liberal Party is hoping to turn this election into a referendum on. Pierre's best hope continues to be for an election where the Liberal Party's 9 years in office is instead the defining ballot question. As I discussed in my video on the Trudeau legacy, the last 9 years have not been a time of economic prosperity for this country. Pierre, accordingly, always tries to redirect the tariff conversation to this line he has about the only reason why Trump poses such a threat is because the Trudeau-Carney Liberals have made Canada so economically weak.
Do you believe that the Trudeau-Carney Liberals deserve a fourth term of hiking taxes, doubling housing costs, blocking resource projects, and making us hopelessly dependent on the Americans?
So his goal is to make the election conversation as much about the past as the future, with voters being asked to judge the two parties' economic competence in a broad sense. All right, and now let me just say a few things about the other parties. Jagmeet Singh and the NDP, Canada's furthest left party, have been, I am sorry to say, perhaps the single biggest losers of the last few years of Canadian politics. Under Singh's leadership, the NDP has done what the NDP believes it was put on this earth to do, which is hold the balance of power in a closely divided parliament and push a weak Liberal Prime Minister into supporting more left-wing policies than he might otherwise want. In 2022, Singh formed an alliance with former Prime Minister Trudeau that lasted for 2.5 years and achieved some small policy wins in the form of some very modest expansions of the Canadian Medicare system. But it really does not seem like voters cared much about this at all. NDP support, which was already low, has more than halved since the Alliance days. And it seems that a lot of their former supporters have now migrated to supporting the Liberals under Prime Minister Carney. There are a few plausible explanations for why this might be. One is just that Carney is a more fresh and interesting face to many progressive voters. People were obviously getting pretty sick of Justin Trudeau near the end, but Jagmeet Singh was becoming an increasingly tired character in Canadian politics as well. He has been head of the NDP since 2017, and it is on some level a little baffling that they would choose to run him as their prime ministerial candidate for a third straight election. His first two runs did not yield impressive results, and the whole marketing theory around him, particularly this idea that he would be uniquely exciting to progressives and young voters, does not seem like it's been borne out by any sort of observable reality. I don't want to be too rude about this, but in all of Canadian history, the NDP has never come close to winning a national election. And at some point, you just kind of have to conclude that it's because as a party, they're just kind of culturally prone to making strategically bad decisions. The other conclusion would be that as it has looked more likely that Pierre Poilievre was going to win, progressive voters in this country have become more strategic. It is an interesting phenomenon of Canadian politics that support for the Conservatives and support for the NDP tends to correlate. The conventional explanation would be that Conservative victories are in some part caused by the NDP because, they split the vote on the left and all of that. But it seems equally plausible to me that a willingness to vote NDP could also just reflect a resignation to an assumption that the Conservatives are going to win anyway, and thus progressive voters should just feel free to vote their conscience. But either way, you could say that the fall of the NDP under Jagmeet Singh bodes poorly for two parties. And lastly, we got the Bloc Quebecois of YFB, or Yves-François Blanchet, the French-Canadian separatist party that exclusively runs parliamentary candidates in Quebec. The Bloc traditionally plays a spoiler role for the Liberals in a sort of similar way that the NDP does, except in the Bloc's case, they tend to suck up a bunch of seats in progressive-leaning areas of Quebec that might otherwise go Liberal. Both the Conservatives and the Liberals have their must-win parts of the country, and Quebec is pretty must-win for the Libs. As you might expect, the Bloc Quebecois tends to perform best when French-Canadian nationalism is on the rise, and in recent years that had appeared to be the case. For much of the last 2 years, the Bloc had consistently been in first place in the Quebec polls, buoyed by one of that province's periodic flare-ups and anxiety about immigration that tend to happen every so often.
Quebec says it can no longer accommodate the rising number of newcomers.
YFB, for his part, is a confident and articulate defender of Quebec interests, or at least what he imagines those interests to be, and in many ways, his consistent personal popularity as leader of the Bloc, which is a position he has held since 2019, has been one of the quieter success stories of modern Canadian politics. Quieter, just because no one in English-speaking Canada tends to know or care much about what Quebec is up to, but YFB has been able to keep his party viable at a time when it has been popular to accuse the Quebec separatist movement of losing steam. But that said, more recent polls have shown Bloc support collapsing pretty dramatically in recent weeks. And again, this has been in sync with Trudeau's resignation and Trump's return to power. And thus, in the early days of this election, we have seen Quebec swing back to look like pretty favorable territory for the Liberals. You know, it is easy to see Quebecers as this fundamentally different type of Canadian who think about politics in this fundamentally alien way, but they are ultimately living in the same country as the rest of us and are not blind to the things that the rest of us see. And since we know that Quebec voters tend to lean left overall, it follows that they may just be thinking in the same strategic way as NDP voters, eager to keep Pierre out and trusting of Carney's leadership in the Trump tariff wars in a way they weren't with Trudeau. Alrighty, so that is more or less where I think Canadian politics stands as of now, after the first week or so of the 2025 Canadian election campaign. It feels like a lot of Canadians are not really paying that much attention just yet, and a lot of the early election stories in the papers have not been that exciting. But there is still a month to go, and if there is one thing we have learned about Canada lately, it's that politics in this country can be pretty damn fluid. But let's hear your analysis in the comments below, and let me know if there's any specific angles on this election that you want to see me cover in future videos. Until then, be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Subs are picking up lately, and we are edging ever closer to 1 million. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week.